Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. I want to talk about Celsius Network. They're doing a really cool thing, trying to revolutionize the way we think about financial services. Basically, they're offering their users up to 10% annual interest on their crypto deposits. And there's no secret to how they're doing it. That 10% comes from them sharing 80% of their profits, rather than the minuscule percentage the banks share. Celsius is giving our users $10 in BTC when they make a deposit of $200 or more in crypto or stablecoins when they use promo code Tatiana. Go to celsius.network. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a wonderful segment of the Tatiana Show. Today, I'm joined with Amber Scott. She's my Canadian friend, and we just ran into each other in Riga, and I thought, Amber should come on the show. I don't think she's been on the show yet. But before we get started,
no, it's my first time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really happy to have you here. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to our sponsors, Celsius, of course, go check them out, and our friends over at eToro. Voltoro is not with us today. Unfortunately, Josh is buried in post-fundraising stuff, but he'll be back on the Tatiana Show pretty soon, so don't worry, you won't miss him for too long. But thank you so much, Amber, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about your background in crypto for people who aren't familiar with you. Tell me how you got involved and a little bit of your qualifications. I see you have a lot of letters after your name. You have MBA, CIPPC, CB, down with OPP. There's like a lot of options here. So tell me a little bit about your background and how you got involved in crypto.
Sure. So I'm a big compliance nerd, which means essentially that I try to keep my clients out of trouble. And my start in crypto was completely accidental. In 2013, a friend and colleague and client called me and said that he wanted a hand updating his risk assessment. And he was doing MSB work, so that's money service business work, and payment processing at the time. And he had started to do payment processing for a Bitcoin exchange, and that Bitcoin exchange was starting to take up a lot of his volume. And at the time I said, sure, I can do that. I've read about Bitcoin in Wired. I haven't actually transacted in Bitcoin. So would you be able to pay my retainer in Bitcoin? Because then that forces me to interact with Bitcoin and understand how transactions work. And he said, sure, I don't think it's going to be what you expect it to be. I need you to do a little bit of research. And everything was command line back then. There was no beautiful graphic user interfaces like there are today. Nothing was in a GUI, pure command line. And so he's like, I need you to download a wallet. I'm going to send you a couple of links to articles about basic security. I can't help you set any of this up for reasons that are obvious to anyone who's interacted with Bitcoin. And so you're going to need to do this. This is on a Thursday. And he's like, I'll call you on Monday and let me know if you're ready. And if you're ready, then I'll send the transaction. So Thursday, I'm working on this. Friday, I think I actually missed a meeting just because I was still reading. Saturday, I got in a fight with my partner because I canceled some family plans. And that was, there was just so much that was different about anything that I had interacted with. And there was a lot that I didn't understand. So I will be the first person to flat out say that in 2013, I definitely said things about Bitcoin that were, in retrospect, just about idiotic. And I think that's okay. I think that's part of the learning curve. There's so much there to learn, and there's so much there to process. And even though I didn't understand it, it was something that I was really enthusiastic about. So on the Monday, when he called me to say, okay, are you ready to receive the transaction? I said, no. I mean, no, in the sense that I think there's still so much that I have to learn, but yes, in the sense that I feel like I understand the basic principles of security enough, and I've set up a wallet, and I'm, ready to receive the transaction. Because everyone always asks, did you keep this $100 Bitcoin that you got in 2013? And the answer to that was no.
I feel like that's a rude question. People like...
But
it's like, oh, how much money you have in your bank account? Like, back off.
Yeah. Nobody asks that with fiat, right? Nobody asks that with bank accounts. But
right. That's so weird. I mean, it's a curiosity. I don't blame them, but it is kind of rude if you think about it.
Yeah, it is kind of rude, but I mean, I'll answer it nonetheless, and which is that I think that I really had to do transactions to understand. So part of it was I had to understand how exchanges work. I had to understand how the network works. So to be able to do things, so I bought a tablet that was probably, in retrospect, one of the most expensive tablets to be promptly left on an airplane, given the current price of Bitcoin. I needed to interact with exchanges to be able to understand what was happening in that respect. But that was the beginning for me, and it's just gone from there. I haven't become less fascinated since then.
Are you a Bitcoiner, or do you consider yourself open-minded to other currencies?
Can it be a little of column A and a little of column B? I think
that's
Bitcoin
a good policy.
Is the most, yeah, I mean, I think that Bitcoin is the most secure. It's the most functional. It's the most successful project to date. I'm open to the idea that there might be other things that are as robust and are as useful, but that I haven't seen them yet.
Yeah, I think the jury's still out. Although I feel like a lot of Canadians feel an affinity to the Ethereum project. So what were you talking about in Riga? That was a cool conference, by the way, everybody. If you can go to Baltic Honey Badger, Riga in Latvia is a beautiful place. I had so much fun there. What did you think?
That's always such a good conference. I think it has a really good balance between talks that are very accessible and talks that really challenge me from a technical perspective. But I always feel like both the latest things that are happening from a tech perspective in Bitcoin are discussed at that conference, and that there's also a really good sense of what's happening just from a business perspective and from a community perspective, how people are thinking about things and where needs are. It's one of my favorite conferences, absolutely.
Absolutely, I think so too.
And this year it had musical performances, which were amazing. It was so cool. Loved seeing you up on stage performing. And speaking as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the first time actually that I did a free Ross talk with my music. I usually talk about it a little bit, but I kind of went through some of the facts. And it's always surprising how few people really know, what happened with that case. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So I think it works, to mix it in with music. I've actually done the talk in Bitbrum recently. So that was really neat too. And I'll probably kind of mix it in there because, Ross is still in jail. So freeross.org, everybody. Make sure you sign the petition. So I want to ask you, so everybody listening to the show knows that I'm kind of anti-regulation because, a lot of the problems that I see in the world have been caused through government and through their regulation. And the thing with crypto that's so awesome is that it doesn't require asking people for permission. But at the same time, we don't live in Ancapistan, and in order to sort of push things forward, you kind of want to get some rules on the books so businesses can function essentially. And I think that that's where you're kind of bridging the gap. I'm curious what your thoughts are about regulation from a government perspective versus something that's implemented by the community. Have you given that any thought, and have you seen any progress on the community front versus the regulatory front? I know you're working in Canada, and I believe that they have a more favorable framework there, but what are your thoughts on that generally, and maybe if you have any specific examples?
So, I think there's different intents in terms of what communities do from a governance perspective than there is when governments impose regulation. And generally speaking, I don't think that there's malice there, but my saying that I don't think that there's malice there isn't the same as my saying that I think that things that we do, that governments do from a regulatory perspective, are necessarily effective or well implemented. I don't know that I think that Canada has a more favorable regulatory regime. So my practice is a lot in the area of anti-money laundering, and all of the countries, or rather most of the countries in the world, are members of something called the Financial Action Task Force. And the Financial Action Task Force publishes things that are in essence principles that countries then take and translate into laws and have to comply with. And countries are evaluated in terms of how they're doing against that Financial Action Task Force standard. So they're referred to as being recommendations, but they're quite powerful. Recommendation sounds like a very soft term, and I don't think that they're that they're really soft in that countries are evaluated against them. And if you're not compliant with that, that can cause problems for a country economically. So all of the countries that are part of the G20 group of countries have committed to implementing the Financial Action Task Force recommendations in terms of virtual assets and virtual asset service providers, or VAS, which is my least favorite acronym because it's quite hard to pronounce. But all of these countries have committed to having things implemented within the next year. So I think that what we see from a Canadian perspective and from a U.S. perspective, given a relatively short timeline, are going to look very similar. Canada was much slower to implement that, and that came back to a decision, I think it was around 2013, where the U.S. had said, yeah, cryptocurrency falls under existing money transfer rules, and so the rules that are there already apply, and you need to get registered as a money service business. You need to follow the existing rules. Where in Canada, our government looked at it and said, these rules don't apply. These rules apply to fiat currency, but not to cryptocurrency. And so we want to apply them to cryptocurrency. We actually had a measure that passed in our budget in 2014, but before it was actually enforced, there had to be regulation. And the regulation was just published last year, and it comes into force next year in June. So at that point, we're essentially going to be acting in many of the same ways. And I think that we're going to see that worldwide. The other thing that's probably important to mention is that none of the regulation that I've seen to date in this space is trying to regulate technology. It's trying to regulate businesses that do things with technology, but not the technology itself. And that might seem like a really weird distinction to make, but I think that it's a fairly important one. In that the regulation that exists in my country and in your country isn't really interested in the trend, like in the peer-to-peer transactions that you and I are doing between each other on the network, as much as it's interested in regulating exchanges and brokerages. And I don't think that piece is necessarily a bad thing if it's done well.
But is it done well? I mean, look at the BitLicense. I talked to the Paxos guys, and I think that they finally just got their BitLicense approved after 5 years. I mean, I can only imagine the millions of dollars that they paid in legal fees for that. So not that, that one legislation is so wonderful. I guess I get frustrated when, you have the financial crisis, the banks get bailed out, there's lots of corruption at the top, and it just seems like they're kind of harassing the new players. I mean, this is slightly off topic, but there was just a boat with $2 billion with a B dollars worth of cocaine that was owned by Chase. Like, I don't know, why isn't anybody getting in trouble for that? You know what I mean? You got like some kid on the corner selling a joint, goes to jail forever, and these guys have $1 billion boats, coke on them, and it's all right. I mean, that,
and yeah, no one's
disingenuousness.
serving 2 double life sentences over that.
Right, exactly. So it's just, I don't know, I feel like it's disingenuous, and I think that a lot of the major banks, from the input that I've gotten from people that are in the drug war, like on the law enforcement side, I mean, those banks are laundering drug money all the time, and then nobody ever gets in trouble for it. So that's why I get kind of, I don't know. I mean, have you seen any good examples in the community, like of self-regulation? Because people talk about that, and then they don't end up really doing anything about it. They're like, oh, well, we need a regulatory body, and then nothing happens. And then there was that one where I think it was a bunch of exchanges maybe a month or so ago that decided to come into an alliance and decide which coins were acceptable or not. And then the community gave pushback on that as well.
Yeah, I think self-regulatory work is, first of all, it's big, thankless work, and it doesn't work all the time. Probably, I would say even most of the time. The only area I've seen where there's still really a real strong self-regulatory presence, at least in the Canadian context, is with lawyers. And I would argue that some of the time that shouldn't really be the case, that maybe there should be more regulation that applies to that profession. And I would say that simply because there's not a lot of teeth in cases where we have corruption. And there are definitely individuals that when you talk to lawyers that are above board, they're like, oh no, everyone knows that there's some kind of malfeasance happening. Everyone knows that what that person is is doing isn't necessarily above board, but they're still practicing. They still have their license. And so in terms of crypto, what I've seen isn't really so much people getting together and deciding to self-regulate and that working well. I think that we've seen a few instances of that have been fraught with peril. And some of that, when you look at token categorization, when you look at things like the SAFT, yeah, it's great if people from the community get together and say, here's what we think something should be. But when there's actual law and regulation that applies, and this is where I think the SAFT sort of went wrong, is that they said, here's this way to categorize tokens, and here's a way to do a token sale that's going to make it not a security. But if you don't have buy-in from any of the actual securities regulators, and those securities regulators exist, and they have jurisdiction to regulate things that are securities in the places where you're operating, that's a problem. So you can't just say we're going to self-regulate and ergo we don't have to actually consult with the regulators. There's a lot more nuance than that, and it's a lot of work to actually do those things. So I think that it's really difficult in most industries to actually achieve a self-regulatory organization that's going to have the right expertise, that's going to make a lot of sense, that's going to be funded. So one of the interesting things that I've found just in participating with different industry organizations is that funding is often really an issue. So everyone wants somebody to do it. Everybody wants somebody to step up and lobby. But it's hard to get someone who A, wants to do the work, and B, wants to pay for the work. And those are big challenges, and that's no different in crypto than in any other industry.
This episode of The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by eToro.com. You can trade in a wide range of assets, connect with the crypto community, and automatically copy top-performing portfolios at eToro.com. Quite simply, they have the top currencies, smart tools, low fees, social trading, all in one simple app. They facilitate over $1 trillion in trading volume per year globally. eToro makes powerful trading tools easy. Get started in minutes right now at eToro.com. That's eToro.com.
I mean, that's a great insight. I'd love to see, some examples of it. I wonder if people are not really motivated to do it because they know they have to work with a regulatory framework. Like, I wonder what would happen in a free market situation where people didn't have that built-in regulation that's enforced upon them. I don't know. I guess their motivation isn't really there. They're like, well, we're kind of subject to these rules as it is. Where do you see the best regulation worldwide? Is there a place that you've really checked out and you're like, wow, these guys are doing it right? I mean, it seems like Estonia has a lot to offer. I'm going to be interviewing the guys from Isle of Man. Is there a place where you think they are getting it right?
I think that Bermuda should definitely be on your list.
Really I interviewed them and I wasn't so sure how it compared to some other places. I thought that they were still somewhat restrictive, but maybe things have evolved. I mean, we spoke in the beginning of the year, so much changes between now and then. Tell me.
Yeah, so I think they are. When you say that they're somewhat restrictive, I don't think that that's inaccurate. But what I would say about Bermuda is that I think they're doing a really good job at trying to understand things from a few different perspectives. So they are looking at fitting into the FATF framework. They're looking at being compatible with other countries. So really taking an approach that's going to have appeal, to bigger jurisdictions and be compatible with those things. But also they're really trying to understand the technology. They're trying to leverage technology in their approach. And if I understood it correctly, and don't get me wrong, I don't speak on behalf of the Bermudan government in any respect, but if I understand them correctly, what they really want to do is to develop a model that's very tech savvy that they can export. And so they're really looking at being, the model country that other countries that are FATF member jurisdictions can say, hey, this is a great approach. Let's take that approach. Let's leverage this technology. Let's see that as a model for how to do things right. And it isn't necessarily, easy. So it's not necessarily the path of least resistance, but if it ends up being the place that is most compatible with other jurisdictions, I think that might be a win.
What do you think about these small countries? Maybe they get a little too much progress. You know what I mean? Do you think that there's a concern I mean, for many years, right, there's sort of havens where you can build businesses and not necessarily have as restrictive of an environment. But do you think that they become subject to the larger countries around them if they, for example, are too revolutionary? Or is that not something that you're worried about?
I think there's always an it depends. So again, from the Financial Action Task Force perspective, they maintain a list of how compliant countries are, and if countries are deemed to be non-compliant, they get on a sort of a bad list, if you will, a high-risk country list. And in terms of that piece, no one really wants to be on that list. It makes it difficult to do business. It can lead to problems for that country's banks in terms of accessing correspondent banking networks. And so I don't think that it's about, being too revolutionary, but you have to prove that you're still doing these things that you're beholden to doing if you're a member country or just as a member of the global financial system. And so I think that it's looking at it from a couple of different perspectives. And one of those is, yes, let's be revolutionary. Let's build something better. But also, let's make sure that we're effective in, detecting, deterring, preventing things like money laundering and terrorist financing from happening. So when it comes out that one of these countries is, a haven for money launderers or criminals or folks that are evading taxes, then the bigger countries around them tend to, grumble and take it seriously, and they make their way onto these bad lists. So it's a delicate dance.
Excellent answer. I like it. I was worried. I was like, I don't know about all this compliance talk, but I think that these are some really useful insights for people to think about it from a different perspective. I mean, I've heard people say, oh, regulators are not evil. I'm like, still not completely convinced, but I think that these seem like, reasonable considerations, especially for businesses that are, trying to not break the law. I certainly don't encourage that. I think it's really important that people do follow the law. Problem is that the law is a little bit skewed sometimes. I mean, look at what happened to Ross. It's terrible,
Absolutely.
but don't step out of line, people. You better follow your rules. What are you most excited?
I think it's important to look at it in two different ways. Like on one hand, you have to look at what's the law that applies to me. How do I do what I need to do for me to protect myself and to protect my business today? And you make those decisions, and those are risk-based decisions. And there are things that I advise my clients on that I don't like. And let me be straight up. I mean, one of those that I think is really fascinating is marijuana. So Canada, pot is completely legal now, by the way. So you can smoke pot to your heart's content. But there's differences in terms of who can sell it. And in the province that I live in, Ontario, it can only be sold through very specific stores, and those stores buy their marijuana from the government. So still, even though marijuana is legal, if you're a financial business and there's someone who is your customer that is a pot dealer, that is not a sanctioned pot dealer, then that's still an illegal business. And so there's still, even though pot is legal, that's still problematic. So you get into some really interesting territory with these things. And so on one hand, when you get into it, you have to look at, what do I have to do to follow the law for myself and for my business? And then on the other hand, what can I do in terms of influencing policy, in terms of talking to policymakers, in terms of having better law, in terms of expressing myself politically? And those can be very different things. So when it comes to, if we know that this money is coming from an illegal business, do we have to file a suspicious transaction report if we're a reporting entity? The answer is yes. Also, it will probably never go anywhere beyond that, but you file it nonetheless, because that's the risk decision to protect yourself and your business. On the other hand, how do you become active in terms of talking with your politicians, in terms of expressing yourself and becoming part of consultations when they're available about what the laws should be? And I think that there's a staggering number of consultations that are done by different entities, either political entities or regulatory entities, that people just don't respond to. And that's really fascinating to me. I'm a big fan of the idea that whenever those come up, if you have a strong opinion on it, there should be a response. And if you're afraid of a response being attributed to you, you can go through a consultant or a lawyer or an industry association, and there's all different ways to participate in those processes that aren't necessarily linked to your name. If that's something that you're sensitive about, and depending on what other risks you're taking, maybe that is a thing that you should be sensitive about. I think that's a very individual decision. For a person and for a company in terms of what positions politically you want to be linked to. But there are definitely options to make opinions heard. And that's, if I get on a soapbox about one thing, it's that I really think that people should harness those more often. People should participate in those processes. People should make their opinions heard. People should sign petitions like the Free Ross petition, because those things are important. And when enough people participate in those, they do have the ability to influence policy. Sometimes even very small things can influence policy in unexpected ways. And so I think that it's important that we all just keep trying and keep expressing those opinions, because that's one of the things that will push us to a better place in terms of overall regulation and policy and law.
What are you most excited about for 2020? We're closing out the year. Crypto had a pretty good year. Wasn't bad. Better than last year's ending. But what do you think? What's going to happen? Any predictions, any enthusiastic encouragements to check out certain projects, anything that you're digging in space?
I am really fascinated by kind of what I think about as being the arms race between privacy and having really more privacy intensive functionalities on different networks, including the Bitcoin network, and the ability to track and trace and do analysis in terms of the transactions that are occurring on that network. That's one of the things that I'm watching and just fascinated by on an ongoing basis. I think there are very strong arguments for both of these things, but I think that as cryptocurrency moves more into the mainstream, we really do need to think about privacy as being an individual right, as being a basic human right, and what does that look like, and how do we do better at protecting people. That actually might be a good example of things that I think the technology community is having great conversations about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know, every day I'm getting all this news about what's happening in Hong Kong, and it really, and actually really all over the world. There's so many protests right now, and all of a sudden, the metal meets the road or whatever it is. And, these technologies are getting tested in real time in actual use cases that are really, really important, which are sort of the things that we're all like, well, you never know what could happen. And everybody thinks you're just like a conspiracy theorist. But I mean, there's like all sorts of weird, crazy stuff going on in the world. It's nice to see technology giving people an option when they don't have one, to get the word out. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a good opportunity for countries that, in my opinion, if you're a government, you should want to get on board with crypto. Well, number one, because you want to preserve your power, but also because there's a lot of benefits to government from crypto. I just don't want them to catch on to the ones where it turns into 1984. So let's kind of delay that a little bit and keep the eye on the prize.
There are situations where I think 1984 is kind of right, but they're probably not the same ones that you're thinking of. And what I mean by that is that I think there are organizations that have an obligation to transparency, and specifically government organizations. So a lot of those 1984 technologies, I think, should actually be turned not on a focus to individual citizens, but on a focus to government.
Absolutely.
I think that there have been really fascinating things that have happened with things like OpenGov projects, where this data becomes public, and all of a sudden there are a ton of armchair sleuths that are able to log in and analyze data and see patterns. That's going to have an incredible impact over time in making corruption more findable, more prosecutable, more traceable, and hopefully less attractive for folks. Like I would love for politics not to be the path of least resistance for the corrupt.
Yeah, I'm with you. I like this convo. We need to have more of these convos. Where can people catch up with you and maybe partake in some of your services, get some good advice, have you come speak at an event? Where can we find you?
So I am outliercanada.com or Outlier Canada on Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks again to our sponsors, Celsius and eToro. And we'll see you guys next time on The Tatiana Show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey there, it's time for the show, The Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. We gotta think and reflect and use lots of intellect with our hearts when we work together. I know that it can be so hard out there, looking all around and saying that life ain't fair. So that is why we will fight and stay up late at night, listening to the Tatiana Show. Thank you for listening to The Tatiana Show. Please follow us on Twitter at Queen Tatiana or on Facebook and Instagram at Tatiana Moroz Music. More episodes can be found at thetatianashow.com, and make sure you leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends. What's the point of all this technology without a little love in our lives? Our hosts, Tatiana Moroz, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, and Lauren Kasovitz, have come together to bring you Proof of Love. Go to proofoflovecast.com. The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by CryptoMediaHub.com, a boutique marketing and PR agency for Bitcoin and beyond.